Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to welcome you to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Dr. Leonard Shlain, physician, philosopher, writer. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
We are talking today about one of your books called Art and Physics, Parallel Visions in
Space, Time, and Light.
Space, Time, and Light. He's also the author of some other books called The Alphabet and the Goddess, Image versus Word.
Right.
And Sex, Time, and Power, subtitled?
How Women's Sexuality Shaped Human Evolution.
Yes, so I'm sure you'll find these interesting, but let's start with art and physics. Tell us about your background and then how you started this.
Well, first of all, you have to know I'm a surgeon, and one of the first questions that a lot of your viewers will say is, how did a surgeon come to write a book about art and physics? And I feel kind of privileged to be on this program because I can't think of another place in the country that more combines art and physics than Santa Fe, with its Santa Fe Institute and Los Alamos, and then this incredible art community here in town and in the state. So to give you a little background, you know, I took pre-med at University of Michigan and went through one of those compressed courses and got into medical school, and right through medical school into a residency at Bellevue and into the military. And my God, I felt like I'd spent 13 years in Marine boot camp, you know. I mean, it was so intense. And I had also had 3 children along the way. I knew I made it home 3 nights, and I had this oldest daughter who was exhibiting some of my fantastic artistic capabilities. So I thought it'd be a really good idea if father and daughter went to New York City and visited the great legacies of Western civilization that are in New York that are not necessarily in San Francisco where we reside. So we started with the Museum of Modern Art, and you know, I had my 12-year-old daughter. I'm trying to imbue her with the feeling I have about great French Impressionist art and the opening rooms of the Museum of Modern Art. These paintings are there, and she's oohing and eyeing, and I'm pleased that she's loving these paintings. And then, as you move into the museum, the art becomes progressively more modern. And pretty soon, I had my daughter tugging on her father's sleeve, saying, "Daddy, explain this to me. I mean, I could do this. I mean, why is this hanging in a museum?" And I was growing increasingly discomfited because I couldn't explain it to her. And I thought, you know, I'm a reasonably alert member of the species. How come I don't understand this? So later we were down in the museum bookstore, and I was leafing through this beautiful book on prehistoric cave paintings. And I looked up from the book, and I saw that the bookstore was filled with books about every conceivable culture, movement, historical period. I thought, isn't this interesting? Art's been in existence for about 35,000 years, and every culture has created an art that's been distinctive. And the one thing that's common to all these different arts cultures is that the other members of the culture could understand the art. It had never happened before that the people looking at the art couldn't understand it. So I thought to myself, my luck that I should live in the time when the art is disconnected from the public. So on this trip, I was reading a book on modern physics. And I've always been kind of interested in modern physics because I think physics is the new belief system about how the world works. I mean, physicists tell us that this table here is not solid, that it actually consists of atoms that have lots of spaces in between it and spaces between the atoms. And gee, it sure seems solid to me, but they've done the experiments, and I take it on faith that what they're telling me is the truth, and that as a belief system, it's like early religion and shamanism and philosophy. And so I was reading about quantum jumping, and they said, you know, the electron is in certain orbits around the nucleus, and when it's in a lower orbit and it takes on energy, it jumps to a higher orbit. It's in the lower orbit and it's in the higher orbit, but you can't find it in between. I said, wait a minute, if something that's here and it goes to there, it has to pass in between. I said, no, the nature of the quantum jumping is that you're not allowed to find it in between. Well, it's the probability of where it is. So I thought, I got really good stat scores in school. How come I don't understand that? So while I was puzzling this sort of Zen koan, the next day we're in the Whitney Museum and we're looking at this large abstract painting, and my daughter's tugging on her father's sleeve saying, Daddy, explain this to me. And I thought, isn't this interesting? Art became inscrutable at the precise moment that physics became impenetrable. That this was the moment in time when people could not understand what the dominant belief system of the culture was trying to say. And I thought, maybe there's a connection there. So I came home and I started giving a series of lectures, and before I knew it, I was writing a book. And I'd never written a book before, which was a problem. But to prevent this book from sinking into a morass of names, dates, and movements, I decided I would hone down on three aspects of reality: space, time, and light. And the thesis of art and physics, which is a little bit different than most art history books, because most books about art talk about who influenced the artist in the past, or they talk about the artist as a social critic describing the life of the day, or they talk about the artist expressing their inner angst. And, my take was that the artist serves another function in the society. Ezra Pound said that the artist is the antenna of the race, and that the visionary artist is the first person in the culture to see the world in a new way. And because there's no words to talk about it, they express that vision using the language of image and metaphor. And then, about the same time or shortly thereafterwards, a revolutionary physicist has a new way to think about the world. And again, because there's no words to express that, they use the language of numbers and equations to talk about this new vision. But if you take the artist images and you superimpose them on the physicist equations, you find that there's a strikingly appropriate fit. So this book is a examination of the parallel periods in history when the artist anticipated and foreshadowed what was later to come to be a complete paradigm change in the way we view the world. So I started with space, time, and light. So, you would think that there are many ways to think about space, time, and light, but in the ancient world, there's really only about three. I mean, there was only a few. I mean, the ancients thought about space. They admixed the inner space of myth, trance, and dream with the outer space of so-called objective reality. And time for the ancients swung between the life of the mortals, the life of gods, the life of... They never had a clear conception of time. And light was always thought of as a religious essence, So what happened is the classical Greeks changed all that, because a man by the name of Euclid founded the first science of space called geometry, and I doubt that any of your viewers managed to get out of school without having to read the second most widely read book in the world, or some part of it, called Euclid's Elements. And then Aristotle came after, about the same time. He came up with this idea of causality and logic and syllogistic logic, so that time proceeded in a linear fashion.
Causative,
Right.
post hoc ergo propter hoc,
Yes,
after this,
exactly.
therefore because of this.
So between Euclid's homogeneous space and Aristotle's linear time, the Greeks made a whole series of discoveries that allowed them to that form the basis of all the curriculum in most of the college universities today. Of course, the artist anticipated all that, because Greek artists were already exploring many of the issues of statuary and paintings and sculpture and architecture. And then, of course, the Romans conquered the Greeks, and they said, we like this concept of space-time and light exactly as it is. They'll make no corrections and additions. So the classical world pretty much thought about it the same way. And then Rome collapsed, and with it the Dark Ages began, and a whole new ideas about space, time, and light came into being, and space splintered into different realms. I mean, you can no longer connect heaven and earth and the space you fell on off the ends of the earth with Euclidean theorems. And time, too, had different durations. There was past, present, and future, and then there was this qualitatively different kind of time called eternity that began on Judgment Day. and eternity differed from the future, and then nothing ever happened in eternity. I mean, nobody has a baby or wins an award or loses their job. I mean, nothing happens in eternity. So light once again reverted to this religious essence coming down from the sky. And then what happened is that all changed when Einstein, at the beginning of the, well, first Newton introduced a whole new conception of space-time and light, and that was called the classical physics. And then Einstein introduced a notion that changed the way we think about space-time and light. And he was a child, and when as a child he asked the question, what would the world look like if I could ride a beam of light? I mean, what would I see if I looked forward? What would I see if I looked off the side? What would I see if I turned around and looked behind me? And of course, he was too unsophisticated to answer the question, so when he was an underemployed patent official in Bern, Switzerland, he published in 1905 this special theory of relativity, which changed the way we think about space-time and light. Earlier, a young artist by the name of Pablo Picasso had moved to Paris and teamed up with another artist by the name of George Braque, brought out a whole new way to see space called cubism. And cubism fractured perspective so that there was, you know, perspective had this view that there was one privileged location from which to view a painting. And, you know, you had to stand in the right place to see the illusion, and if you got off too far off to the side or too close up, you couldn't see the proper illusion.
But wasn't the perspective like the hallmark of Renaissance
Exactly.
painting? And that's what they all studied. That was like,
well,
that
perspective was the way Western artists made painting for like 500 years. And then, of course, Newton, you know, science began after perspective in the discovery of perspective in art, and beginning with Galileo and ending with Newton, the physicists defined a privileged location in the universe from which to measure the world. Newton called it the inertial frame of reference. And he said that a scientist sitting on this privileged platform that was motionless could measure the world without having to take into consideration anything else. So Newton's inertial frame of reference idealized platform was just like the perspectivist point of view in art, but the artist came first. And then Einstein completely changed all that by saying all inertial frames of reference are in motion relative to all other inertial, and each one is just as good as any other. At the moment that cubism shattered the idea that there was one privileged location from which to view a painting. Of course, Cézanne had already introduced that notion 20 years earlier. And then, of course, you had Minkowski, this physicist who invented or discovered that Einstein's equations led to the concept of the fourth dimension. But Monet, 20 years earlier, in studying the effects of light, was painting haystacks in the summer and came back and painting haystacks in the winter, as if to say, I can't show you the essence of haystacks unless you see not only where they're located in space, but how they change in time. Well, if you put a Minkowskian space-time diagram and Monet's haystack series next to each other, what's the difference? I mean, they're both saying essentially the same thing. One's using numbers and equations and graphs, the other one's using images and metaphor.
Could the scientists have formulated those numbers and graphs without the images and the archetypical, in a way, vocabulary of the artist's images that have been presented to the culture?
I want to make it clear that I'm not proposing that the physicist got his idea from the artist or the artist was influenced by the physicist. These are two parallel visions moving alongside each other. You know, Einstein, because he couldn't explain what he discovered, so he came up with the Gedanken experiment. And he said, imagine that, you know, you're on a train ride and you're traveling very high relativistic speeds. You know, time would dilate, space would contract. Well, that was the time that the artist suddenly distorted space. Giacometti was making these big, tall characters, just like you would see if you were traveling on a train ride at relativistic speeds. Modigliani and Picasso was making these very thick, classical figures, and the, you know, Manet in 1863, long before the physicist was understood that there was something wrong with Newton's classical mechanics, had painted this painting called Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is Luncheon on the Grass, which the critics hated, and one of the things they hated about it was that the woman in the background would have to be about 9 feet tall if she was corrected for perspective. Well, Manet was a master craftsman, and he was basically saying, enough with perspective. It's now time to look at the world in a new way. So you have Cézanne and Monet and Manet introducing in the late 19th century ideas that would become the basis of 20th century physics. So, so you have, for example, the futurists, who came up with this idea of painting motion. So they painted these paintings where you could see multiple durations of time simultaneously. So, for example, there's a painting by an Italian painter, Balla's Dog on a Leash, where you can see the dog's, all his legs in motion in different durations. So when you're walking your dog, you can't see that. Well, Einstein said if you traveled on his train at high relativistic speeds, you begin to see the past, the present, and the future all in one. For example, Duchamp made this famous painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, that when it was shown in New York, one art critic said that it looked like an explosion in a shingle factory, or that it looked like a staircase descending a nude. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt attended the thing, and he compared the painting unfavorably to a Navajo rug. But this is one of the seminal paintings of the 20th century, and in it you see what we think is a woman walking down a flight of stairs, and we see where she was, where she is, and where she's going to be. Well, if you took everybody down to the Amtrak station and you put them on a train and you started traveling at close to the speed of light, and you were whizzing past buildings and you saw a woman walking down a flight of stairs, you'd see where she was, where she is, and where she's going to be. So there's this extraordinary parallel that keeps occurring in art and physics. And when a child is born, they don't know language. And it takes them a while to grasp concepts. And in a baby's world, they see this object that's white, and sometimes it's rectangular, and sometimes it's circle, and sometimes they see it end on. And they come to recognize that this is a bottle, and bottle is something that gives sustenance. So they grasp the concept of bottleneck. And it doesn't matter how you turn the bottle, they get it, it's a bottle. And they point to it. They have the image of the bottle. And then language starts somewhere around 2 years old, and they learn that there's a word bottle. And once they stamp the word bottle on this image of the bottle, they never have to think in images again. And that's the majesty and the tyranny of language. That once we learn words for things, we don't have to think in images about them. So we can talk about freedom and justice and destiny. We don't have to think in images. But what happens when culture develops concepts for which there are no images? So who is it in the culture who's going to create the images that will allow the rest of us to begin to understand what it is that we've discovered? And I maintain it's the artist. For example, I give a lot of lectures, and if I were to mention the name Dali, what comes up is melting watches. What is it about this painting that everyone seems to be aware of this painting? And if you look closely at the painting, what it is it's about melting watches on a sandy beach crawling with ants. Now, I can't think of another image of time that is more appropriate for ants, because ants are the ant and the grasshopper, the patient, industrious ant. And ants are shaped like hourglasses, which is another image of time. So here's an artist that conflates 4 images: sand, hourglasses, ants, and melting watches. And at some unconscious level, your mind swings around to think about the concept of time. I'm not saying that Dali set out to say, oh, I'm going to make an image of Einstein's theory of relativity of what happens when you travel at relativistic speeds, but I'm basically saying that the artist, a lot of the art of the 20th century has been to supply the rest of us with images that will help us understand what our art is trying to say. And because the physics has become space-time, quantum jumping, black holes, it's just left the public.
Are there some other artists that you feel, besides Dali, that concretize these images for us?
Well, for example, I mean, you know, it's interesting that in 1905, when Einstein published his special theory of relativity, 1905 was the year that three artists, Matisse, Derain, and Vlamnik, exhibited a group of paintings in an old warehouse that were just riotous color. And one art critic who came to see them said, "My God, these guys are like wild beasts." And the French word for wild beast is fauve, so they called them fauvists. And they said that the subject matter of every painting is color. Well, color is light of variable wavelengths. So isn't it interesting that, you know, color was a denigrated value in Western art for a very long time. I mean, you know, Ingres, the famous neoclassicist, said, you know, drawing is the probity of art. And Kant agreed with him and said, you know, art is about subject matter and hierarchy and composition. And oh yes, the artist can pick up their palette and add color at the end, but that's not the main part of art. Probably the most succinct attitude about color was said by the English connoisseur William Beaumont, who once said, a good painting, like a good fiddle, should be brown. So as a result, we had all these brown sauce paintings. So then color starts to reemerge in the 19th century, and a whole bunch of different artists in different countries start to use color. And then, of course, Manet and the Impressionists really bring color out. And then the noble savage of color was Van Gogh, who was so excited by the bright hues coming out of his paint tubes, he threw his brushes away, altogether sort of ladled the paint onto his canvases. And then, so you see this color rising in value in the late 19th century, and then in 1905, it gets crowned in this Fauvist exhibition where the Fauvist artist said, it's color. That it's okay that I paint the skies purple and I paint a green stripe down a woman's face, or that I
paint green trees red instead of green, or the sea yellow instead of blue.
Color is the most important element in art. This is the moment in time that Einstein first combined space and time using the quicksilver crazy glue of light, or more appropriate, the speed of light. And then a few months later, he comes up with this enormously important little equation called E is equal to mc squared, where he says not only is space and time related to light, but energy and matter are related to light, and it's the speed of light. So in 1905, when the Fauvists declare it's color, which is light of variable wavelengths, Einstein says light is the quintessence of the universe. That Einstein once said that all he wanted to do was spend the rest of his life studying the nature of light. So you see this parallelism between the artist and the physicist.
One of your illustrations in your lectures, you do William Blake's drawing of Euclid.
Of Newton.
Yeah,
measuring.
with his compass measuring space, and then the element of time is added, and then light and color and energy. Where are we now, and where's art taking us now?
Well, it's a difficult question, because in order to be able to know who the visionary among our artists are today, you'd have to be a visionary yourself. And Marcel Duchamp, when he was in his 80s, was invited by the New York Art Dealers Association to give a talk, an after-dinner talk, and he said his assignment was who's who in art today. So as they were clearing away the coffee cups, you know, every art dealer had their little notebook up, because they knew that any name that Duchamp was going to mention was going to be worth a lot of money the next day. So the grand old man stood up and he said, "Beware wet paint," and then he sat down. So, so I would respond by saying that it's very. I mean, when you think that in the 1880s, the winners of the Salon that were winning the prizes were no one that people want to look at the art today, and yet Van Gogh, who couldn't give a painting away, I mean, they have a Van Gogh exhibition today, and people come in a reverential attitude like they're in cathedral, you know. So we've been wrong so many times about who is influential and who's not, and who, you know, the difference between science and art is that science, in order to be science, has to be able to predict the future. I mean, a scientific law is useless unless it can anticipate what's going to happen. Art, on the other hand, does not become great art unless it is viewed through the lens of posterity. Art has to be around for a while before people can look back and say, that was great art, that's enduring. So there's this major difference between art and science, but despite the differences between art and science and art and physics, you know, T.S. Eliot once said that great art is understood before it's comprehended. I mean, you know, that when you're in the presence of a great work of art, you may not understand it, but at some level it resonates with you. And you're not quite sure what that is, but it's getting through. And as a result, you have this extraordinary function of the artist and the physicist, who are the two prongs of how we are investigating the nature of reality.
Well, I wonder at my own level of understanding and comprehension, but I'm fascinated by what you bring to us. And I want to remind our viewers that the book is called Art and Physics, Parallel Visions in Space, Time, and Light. And its author, thank you so much, Dr. Leonard Shlain, for spending the time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'd like to thank you, our viewers, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.